Hello. Oh, right. Okay. Happy Wednesday, everyone. Happy Monday? Monday? Yeah, no, it's definitely Monday because um, on Wednesday I have a yeah, thank you. Um, on Wednesday I have Brian David Earp coming on, who is a researcher in ethics at Oxford and I think Princeton as well. Is it Princeton? Anyway, he's certainly at Oxford at the with practical ethics group department division not division. Anyway, the important thing is he has written a lot of very interesting stuff. Um, Most notably, or at least most relevantly for Wednesday, a book called Love Drugs, which I'll just quickly advise in case anybody wants to read beforehand. It is quite excellent. So it's written by Brian and Julian Savulescu, who's a professor of ethics here at Oxford as well, and is kind of one of my doctoral supervisors. Brian isn't, but he's nonetheless very interesting. And yeah, so we'll be chatting about the ways we might be able to use pharmacology to impact emotional relationships, which promises to be very interesting. So we'll talk a bit about like why one might want to do that, and also hopefully a bit about kind of the role of practical ethics in society and in the popular discourse. So promises to be very interesting, and I hope anyone watching will watch that as well. Um, so yeah, Wednesday, come listen to me chat with Brian about that. I think that's going to be at 7, I believe. Um, it's going to be a little bit earlier. I'll tweet that out and post on the Facebooks and whatnot. But yes, so come along, watch that, and it'll be good. Excuse me. Oh shit, J Tibbs, you've given me your subscription. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. That's early in the stream for a subscription. It bodes well, I hope. So thank you very much, J Tibbs. You are quite the legend, both for um, well, not to worry. Come back Wednesday if you can, because that'll be the more interesting one today. Um, if you want like short version of today, just kind of read the wiki article on signal detection theory. Um, Hopefully, I'll do a bit more kind of condensed look. But thank you very much, J Tibbs. You are a excellent viewer, and I very much appreciate you. So yeah, awesome. Thank you. Cool. So mm, what I figured I'd talk about today, I didn't have anything big planned, so sometimes you encounter an idea that you encounter in one specific context, context, and yeah, you too, JTIP, thank you. And then you see it in all other areas of life. I mean, not all other, but many, many other areas of life. Um, I'm sure anyone who's kind of well, even if you've just been at school, you occasionally have that little spark of a moment where you learn about something and go, wow, this has profound implications in other areas. And for me, one of those things, one of those ideas has been signal detection theory. And I think it's so I originally learned about this. Well, it's something that I've been vaguely aware of for a while, but I originally learned about it in a proper detail um, in my masters. So I was doing a psychological task involving memory and essentially whether a participant would correctly identify from a list of words a word they were supposed to be remembering. And we were doing this, say, I designed the experiment. It wasn't an especially good one, but nonetheless, it was mine. And the idea was to do non-invasive brain stimulation, so transcranial random noise stimulation. I think I was using. Uh, no, sorry, I was comparing random noise stimulation and anodal transcranial direct current stimulation, um, and a placebo condition, and turning on and off stimulation and seeing whether they got a higher rate of successful guesses in the stimulation condition versus non-stimulation, the other type of stimulation. So um, interesting experiment. It hasn't been published because I didn't find much useful information, and that's a whole different topic that's worth going into. Is the one of the limitations to academic publishing is that if it doesn't provide you super interesting results, it's easy to kind of not publish the results. Not necessarily through any like malice or whatever, but in my case, I had completed my masters and probably could have pushed that through to publication, but I was just starting my doctorate, so it was like, well, I've got this other stuff I want to work on, so I prioritized that in part because the results just didn't seem that interesting. Now, what that might imply is that the thing I was looking at, the type of stimulation I wasn't looking at, is genuinely not an area to be interested in. It would have been valuable to publish that so other people didn't go down that route. Um, and that could have been valuable, or it could have given someone an idea for reading my paper and seeing that it wasn't done very well for whatever reason, and gives them an idea to repeat that. This Laurie is an idiot. He clearly doesn't know what he's talking about. Let's redo that experiment in a better way. So yeah, the file drawer problem is a big issue in science, and it's not like I was sitting there going, haha, these results don't seem to confirm anything. I'm going to not publish them in order to make myself look better, or whatever. Um, it's just the fact that scientists have limited time and attention. Sometimes publishing things is difficult, and the incentives are set up in such a way that it's it's more exciting and more beneficial to one's career, and just generally cooler as a scientist to be working on something you think is going to give that big exciting result. Um, so so yeah. Anyway, that was the project I was working on, and in order to do the statistics properly, I had to learn, or in order to kind of understand how to set up the test at all, really, I had to learn signal detection theory. And while I was learning it in the context of this very specific memory test that I invented, and I don't necessarily recommend anyone try for future experiments, um, nonetheless, the concept of signal detection theory has permeated into many other aspects of my life and my understanding of, um, well, all kinds of aspects of the world. So, in particular, it's highly relevant for medical diagnosis, lots of areas of medicine. It's relevant for satellites and sensors of all kinds. Um, it's very relevant for one of the areas of my interest, which is nuclear war, and how to identify whether the nukes have started flying or not. And security studies like terrorism, all kinds of things. It's extremely useful to know what a signal is telling you and how confident you should be in the signal being right. So this is a fairly simple kind of not that simple but elegant diagram that gives you roughly what you need to know. So what does this mean? Okay, down here is signal strength. Now, for an example here, I'm going to use let's say you're an Apple company and you have a big apple processing machine. You know, your trucks come in laden with apples, and they go in to the machine, and you want to wash them and cover them in wax and whatever Apple producers do. You know, stick a little sticker on them, and then they get taken through this machine to be stored and cut up for usage or whatever. You know, sold, put into the production line. So while this machine is clunking away, you as the apple producer want to be able to identify any bad apples, because some of the apples that have been sent to you by the farmers are bad, are not good for sale, and you don't want any of those getting through to your customers. Now, your signal strength here is, let's say, a sensor that's measuring. I think ethylene is given off by bad apples. Let's assume that ethylene is a chemical given off by bad apples, and your sensor is this is an imaginary sensor. I don't know how apple processing actually works, but just using this as an example. Your sensor is held above each apple in turn, and takes a little sniff to see whether there's any ethylene present, or it can detect any ethylene present. And if it gets a hit, so sorry, if the signal is present, then it rejects the apple, and if it's absent, then sorry, I'm not going to say reject because it rejects something. Then it disposes of the apple, and if the signal is absent, then it lets the apple through. So in this case, you've got four possible outcomes, and you can look at them at a matrix like this. So if the signal is present, then and the apple actually is bad, then that's a hit. You have correctly identified a bad apple, come in with your little robot arm or whatnot, and chucked it in the bin. Good. We wanted that. Now, if the signal is not present and the apple isn't bad, then that's a correct rejection. The robot arm chucker awayer does not engage. It lets the apple pass into the machinery of food distribution, and the apple has been rejected by the system, i.e. in this case allowed to pass. However, if the signal is present and the machine doesn't pick up on it, then i.e. if it's a bad apple which the machine lets go through, then that's a miss. It's missed a bad apple that it was supposed to get rid of. And conversely, if the signal is not present but the machine does respond, then that's a false alarm. So the machine, for whatever reason, falsely senses ethylene. It picks up a good, lovely, shiny apple that has no worms in it and chucks it in the disposal bin. That's a false alarm. Now, in the case of, actually we'll go over this a little bit more. So in terms of signal strength, in our example here, that is the concentration of ethylene being reported by the sensor. So presumably in this machine, there's a computer which is measuring the output of these ethylene sensors. Excuse me. And if the computer flags up that the ethylene is present over the criterion being the threshold that we set the ethylene sensor at, then it flags up that the apple is bad and gets rid of it. Now these two probability distributions represent, the red one is just the noise. So this is just like the background like randomness that affects every complex system. That's if it didn't have any signal whatsoever. And the black one is the signal plus the noise. So this is the actual kind of ideal curve. So there's four possible outcomes that we went through here, and they're represented on the probability distribution. So with the signal plus the noise, if it's over the if it's present and above the criterion, then that's a hit. If it's not actually present, but it does nonetheless come above the criterion, the threshold for detection, and that's a false alarm. And conversely, if it's not present and falls below, correct rejection. If if it is present and falls below, that's a miss. So um, we can imagine this, like say, like a concentration of ethylene, or the strength of signal coming from the ethylene sensor. And you can hi Stanley K. Cly, how's it going? They do this with Lay's chips, they blast pork little air guns, cool. So yeah, it's exactly the same idea. So if the AI has a little signal there, hello, detecting whether the chip is bad or not, and or the crisp in British English, and it will somewhere in the AI there will be a line of calm down, a line of code that has implicitly at least set a criterion, a threshold here. Um, so when the AI gets enough evidence that a chip is bad from its visual sensors or ethylene sensor or whatever, then it'll make a decision based on this threshold as to whether or not to get rid of it. So, like I say, we've got these four conditions, and we have control over a few factors. So ideally, these two um, these two distributions would be completely separated. If they were completely separated, then all present signals would be hits, and all absent signals would be correct rejections. And we could do this by um, reducing the noise or increasing the strength of the signal relative to noise, such that each of the distributions moved apart and became taller and tighter. So we could have essentially two distributions, one here and one here. That would be great. Obviously, in practice, that's impossible in most systems. We might be able to get it really, really good, but there's very few systems that have 100% um, uh, uh, hits with 100% correct rejections. Now, we can change the threshold um, so that um, we move it to the left, which means that more of the hits will get fewer misses because there'll be less of this part, but we'll get more false alarms. And if we did that to the extreme, we could just have the signal chuck out every apple or every potato chip, in which case it would be getting 100% hits. All of the bad apples would definitely be out of the barrel, but no apples or chips would be getting through to the consumers, which is not a great way to run a business. Conversely, we can move the threshold to the right so that only the most extreme signal will trip the system and cause it to reject an apple or chip or whatever, which would be very strong quality control. Sorry, which would guarantee the flow of foodstuffs through the system, but would mean that all of the bad apples get through, which we obviously don't want. And yeah, so as Neon Golden raises, there's applications for this in public health screening. So, say we are trying to identify a very common condition like depression, um, we can pose a battery of tests. Put someone's score on a questionnaire, a depression assessment questionnaire, and maybe their score rated by a psychiatrist or so forth, and set a say they need to get 50 out of 100 on X questionnaire, um, and set the criterion at 50 out of 100, and then there will be a few people who score more than 50 but aren't actually depressed. They just didn't understand a couple of the questions, or they've got some other mental condition that depression is kind of similar to, or one of any other kind of factors, in which case they'd be false alarms. Um, and there's going to be some people who are depressed but are underreporting, um, whether because they don't quite fall under the threshold, or because they um, didn't understand some of the questions or whatever, um, and they end up in the miss column. So one of the and there's, like I say, a whole bunch of areas this applies to, but one of the key things to understand here is that though by setting up the system one can decide kind of how good it is in terms of avoiding false alarms or avoiding misses, excuse me, one has to make some kind of decision as to how sensitive it is or how specific it is, and these are often trade-offs. So sensitivity is its ability to correctly identify, well, correctly make hits. It's basically it's hits over misses rate, and specificity is its correct rejections over false alarms rate. So something that's highly specific only ever, or practically only ever, flags up um, a signal being present when the signal is actually present, and something that's high sensitivity basically never flags it up when it isn't. So the important thing is, as Neon Golden has pretty much just preempted, is that each of these comes with costs. So choosing where to set your threshold is very dependent on what specific thing you want to be sensing, what your goal is with the system. If we're talking about bad potato chips, we don't want bad potato chips. It's probably not great if they get through, but it's not the end of the world if one or two suboptimal ones get through. So we might want to set the threshold, um, moderate. Let's say we're dealing with bad apples, where one bad apple getting through will spoil a bunch of the others during transit. So we want to be extra sure that they don't get through, because they can spoil a whole bunch, as opposed to one potato chip, which doesn't even spoil a whole bag. Um, so we want the system to be getting uh, fewer misses. We shift the. What are you eating? What are you doing? That's a bottle of smelling salts, you weird cat. Um, so we shift the criterion to the left. So we accept um, more false alarms, more good apples being chucked out, in exchange for a higher hit rate, fewer bad apples getting through. Conversely, if we're in the early days of a pandemic and we're wanting to detect the presence of a very dangerous disease in the population, we probably want a test that's extremely sensitive but not necessarily very specific. So we want to shift this uh, uh, to the no, that's the same as the Apple example. Sorry. Um, say we're um, uh, say we're investigating crimes, the criminal justice system. Um, we are because we think that most people generally think that there's a big downside to sending an innocent person to jail, that we should prioritize not sending innocent people to jail in exchange for accepting a few um, uh, criminals going free. Then we want to shift it to the right so that we get very few false alarms, but we increase the number of misses. Um, and in each of these cases, every incorrect decision comes with a cost, and every correct decision comes with utility. And the balance of these varies massively. So if we look at the FDA is a good example of a signal detection mechanism that is perhaps tuned a little bit too tightly. So the FDA is maybe a little bit too sensitive. Um, it wants to a signal present would be a dangerous drug. You know, the FDA development process is designed to identify dangerous drugs before they get to market and get rid of them, prevent them getting to market so they don't harm people. At the moment, the FDA spends a very, very large amount of money ensuring that they get a lot of hits, that any vaguely dangerous drug doesn't get to market because it, understandably, doesn't look good when a drug gets to market, like Vioxx, for example. Vioxx killed something like 50,000 people prematurely. It was a big, big fuck up, um, and is a very salient reason for why we don't want false alarms, i.e., don't want dangerous drugs slipping through. Sorry, why we don't want misses, why we don't want dangerous drugs slipping through the system. However, as Steiny Clay is alluding to, by shifting this too far to the left, we get a lot of false alarms. So we get a lot of potentially very good drugs that don't make it to market because both because directly they're shut down by the FDA and because the cost of getting them to market, or at least the risk of getting them to market past a certain point, is so high that the companies just don't bother continuing to develop them. Which there's several examples you can point to of uh, drugs like the Lyme disease vaccine um, was not brought to market in part because of safety concerns that were probably unfounded, but resulted in most likely a false alarm that increased the cost of bringing it to the market to the point that it wasn't worthwhile. And of course, even if it um, doesn't result in more incorrect assignments, then there's still the fact that uh, increasing the increase the sensitivity or specificity, or um, doing both, particularly doing both, generally results in more expense. Whether that's literally, the sensor system is more expensive, or whether it means more testing, more layers of bureaucracy, or whatever, that may give a better outcome in terms of signal detection, but may well result in inappropriate costs um, being shouldered. Now, this is particularly in the case where you have very low frequency events that seem very amenable to signal detection systems, but aren't necessarily. I have particularly in mind here. Hello, you've been fed, haven't you? Yeah, you have. I have particularly in mind here airport security, where we're dealing with a phenomenon that a terrorism that is extremely low frequency. there are millions and millions of flights a year, and fewer than one of them fucking thing, and fewer than one of them on average uh, occurs per year. Now, obviously, the consequence of a miss, i.e., letting a terrorist event occur, is pretty bad. We can all agree that. On the upper end, you've got, well, theoretically, on the upper end, no, it's not relevant. On the upper end, at least in terms of plane hijacking, which is the relevant thing here, you've got 9/11, something like that, where a airplane can kill thousands of people. So we definitely want them to not occur. Problem is, when you've got something that's that low frequency, even a test that's 99.99% accurate, you're dealing with a 1 in 10,000 um, failure rate there. If it's 99.99% accurate, 1 in 10,000 travelers uh, who aren't terrorists will get flagged up by it. There'll be a false alarm, and their whole day, possibly trip, gets ruined. Occasionally, they get shot or something. Pretty rarely, but at very least, bad things happen to them. And when we're dealing with millions of flights per year, the cost to um, to having such a system in place, even if it's got a very low failure rate, very low false alarm rate, the fact that the base rate of the underlying phenomenon that we're trying to measure is so incredibly low means that the vast majority of signal present events of flagging up are going to be innocent people or are going to be false alarms. So, though we may have a very high threshold that doesn't seem to get passed often, the vast majority of signal present events are going to be false alarms, which we might accept. It might be a cost worth accepting, but often there are lower hanging fruit, and there are ways of improving this kind of this probability distribution without necessarily increasing those costs, or we should just accept a kind of less sensitive system. Um, and one of the reasons I've been thinking about this recently is in terms of nuclear war detection and planning. So currently orbiting the Earth, there are dozens of satellites that are tasked with doing pretty much exactly this 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They have things like infrared sensors that watch at the horizon for the plumes of rocket exhaust coming off ballistic missiles. And when they get a little puff of infrared on their scope, typically there's the modern ones have like a sensor array where there'll be a wide angle one that will pick up a possible event. So this would be a system with kind of multiple signal detection mechanisms. The first one will be just picking up any like potentially relevant event, flagging it, and then automatically zooming in on that area with the infrared camera, looking for this plume. And if they see it, then they flag it to NORAD or where's the uh, Russian command center? I can't remember the name of it, but the Russian equivalent. Um, conspiracy theory stream might be good. Um, though I'm sure I'd get a bunch of crazies on. Um, but yeah, so the thing is with nuclear war, the cost associated with any of these outcomes is extremely high, or any of the incorrect outcomes. Um, if you've got, you know, gigaton or two of warheads bearing down on you, but you don't notice it, you get a miss. Well, that's pretty bad because you can't initiate a second strike. You have no way of avenging your motherland if all of your sensors have failed to pick up the incoming ballistic missiles. However, if you pick up a bunch of incoming ballistic missiles where there aren't any, and you send this up the chain of command to, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or again, whatever the Russian equivalent is, and there aren't a bunch of nukes bearing down on you, then you've started a nuclear war for no reason. You know, well done. So either one is pretty bad. I would argue that the latter is worse. But the thing is, Cold War planners who set up all these systems were very, very worried about the former, about the missing of a signal, particularly earlier in the Cold War. In fact, a lot of the planning that went on throughout the sort of mid to late 20th century was built around um, reducing the possibility of misses occurring, and thereby allowing your country to descend into nuclear hellfire unanswered with, your own missiles. And one of the problems with this is that your time frame for making this decision is not great. It's on the order of half an hour or so, which is roughly the time it takes uh, a missile to ICBM to kind of complete its flight. It's not very long. Um, yeah, yeah. So SDI, SDI was one attempt to kind of interrupt um, this challenging signal detection exercise. Um, so Reagan tried to make satellites that shoot lasers at nukes. And no, we definitely shouldn't have that VA cause list for um, very important reasons that aren't necessarily immediately obvious. But so, backstory. In the early 80s, Reagan was obviously in power, and uh, he was influenced by several things, but one of the things that influenced him was The Day After, which I showed a few clips of um, a few episodes ago, good few episodes ago now. And this was a film about a nuclear war blowing up a small town in the US, and it was, for the time, relatively realistic, and scared the shit out of Reagan, as it did many people of the era. And Reagan started thinking seriously about how to get rid of the looming threat of nuclear war. And Edward Teller, one of the fathers of the hydrogen bomb, had this nifty idea for nuclear uh, nuclear pumped X-ray lasers, which sounds kind of like something I've just made up, but really isn't. Um, it's a fucking batshit idea for a laser system where, so, with the regular laser you've got the excitation medium. You pump energy into the excitation medium, and it lets out a beam of coherent light. Um, and you can do this with electricity or other forms of light or whatever. Um, the idea of a nuclear pumped X-ray laser, or generally nuclear pumped lasers, but X-ray would work best, is to instead of using like electricity to pump energy into the excitation medium, use a nuke, like a nuclear bomb. So you explode a nuke in space, and in the fraction of a second before it blows apart your own satellite, it energizes the excitation medium and sends off a whole bunch of laser beams that are precisely targeted at all of the incoming missiles that are shooting up in your direction, and lasers them and blows them apart, or at least damages the warhead enough that it burns up on re-entry. Um, and Edward Teller's idea, I'm not sure if he originated it, but he was certainly a big supporter of it, was to stick one of these things in space and use it as the system called Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which became known as Star Wars, derisively. And it was, yeah, it's pretty cool, um, but wouldn't have worked. Like, not for shit. It might work today if the US government put like tens to hundreds of billions of dollars into funding it, but probably not. At least not super well. There's a whole bunch of limitations to it, not least of which is tracking. So you've got one of the problems is this signal detection theory problem that um, you need this system to be at least somewhat automated because no human can track multiple objects, each going Mach 20, which is, um, once the MIRV, the multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle, the warhead basically at the top of the ICBM has split off. They're traveling like hypersonic speeds and may change their course a little bit and may have a bunch of decoys and chaff and so on and so forth. So you first got to detect the launch and realize that it's taking place. Okay, we can sort of do that with a whole bunch of problems, but we can do that. Then you've got to identify the location of both the each of the ICBMs themselves, or SLBMs, the big ballistic missiles, and each of the warheads. Or you've got to hit them in the boost phase, which might that's easier to do in technical terms of actually hitting them, but you've got to detect them sooner. So it makes it even more of a signal detection problem. The earlier you do it, the easier it is to hit them with the lasers, but the harder it is to reliably detect them. And you want to be pretty reliable at this because, uh, a false alarm means you're blowing up a nuke in space, and which causes all kinds of EMP problems that, if you did it over a country, could like fucking wreck the country pretty badly, um, and also might, hit Earth with a bunch of X-ray lasers, that's probably not going to be very good. Though I think they'd probably not penetrate the atmosphere. Don't quote me on that. Um, so yeah, back in the early 80s, the US didn't have the computing power to do this targeting problem, um, and even now, but certainly then. And if the US didn't have it, no one did. Uh, and a lot of engineers at the time were pretty aware of this. Like it was. it was fucking ridiculous. Like, and later iterations of SDI did start talking about, space-based kinetic interceptors instead of you know pumped X-ray lasers, but it never really went anywhere despite spending tens and tens of billions of dollars. Um, so unfortunately, all of this activity was serving itself as a signal or a contributor to the signal that the Soviets were using to to determine like how dangerous the US was. Hello. Yeah, I'm talking about nuclear war. Yeah. Um. Yeah. So they had this program called Operation Ryan. Yeah. Where they were taking information from a whole bunch of sources and trying to. I'm kind of confusing things a bit here, but they were trying to use all this information to identify whether the US was going to start a nuclear war. And I should do Operation Ryan in detail some other time, but the kind of top level point is that uh, uh, that the Soviets were trying to infer how dangerous this system was based on limited evidence. So in this kind of paradigm, they were gathering their evidence and they didn't want to miss a potentially dangerous system and like overlook its potential. Um, but you also don't want to put too much stock in how scary an enemy system is. The problem is the Soviet hierarchy had very much impressed upon its intelligence staff that they were to report anything that seemed dangerous, and that there was a lot of danger to them personally to underreporting things and missing things that would later become relevant. And this fostered a culture whereby Soviet intelligence operatives would just report anything that could be even slightly relevant. Um, and they overreported the risks and underreported the like technical limitations. And yeah, I know. And this resulted in this occurred over several layers of the command chain, resulting in a massively increased risk of false alarms. It became an extremely sensitive political system in terms of being able to detect the merest hint of Western imperialist aggression, but also gave the impression that the US was far scarier than they were, and specifically that SDI was far scarier than it is. Thank you, Sandy Cake Like. This is one of the things that's been I've been thinking about recently. If you're interested in a book on this, well, I particularly recommend two. The most relevant here is The Dead Hand, by David Hoffman. Yeah. Um, so it's very compelling. It deserves more than 4.1 on Goodreads. Um, very compelling book about the weapons race, not just nuclear weapons. It also deals with the chemical warfare. Sorry, it touches on chemical warfare, but that's not as interesting. The biological warfare programs of the US and Russia. Russia had a much bigger biological warfare uh, uh, program, but it gives a lot of very useful insight, I find, into the both the political decisions that were going on and some of the machinery, the kind of nuts and bolts. Though the Dead Hand does focus more on the kind of the politics and strategy um, of these systems. Uh, Garrett M. Graff's um, Raven Rock. No, that's actual Raven Rock. Uh, there we go. Garrett M. Graff's Raven Rock is a story of more of the kind of the specific nuts and bolts, the equipment that um, that ran the Cold War. Oh, I'm glad you're enjoying the Precipice, Stanley Cake Light. Good job. Yeah, I would definitely prioritize that over these. But these are very interesting books, and and we want to be, going back to the kind of signal detection stuff. We want to be very careful to keep in mind that whenever you're making a judgment, um, you are employing some degree of kind of signal detection theory, whether you're working out whether someone's lying or not. Yeah, I do need a Goodreads book list. I should uh, maybe I'll do a, I don't know, Patreon goal or something for book rec. Actually, no, I'll just do some book recommendations. Moneygate that thing, but but yeah, whenever you're like judging whether someone's lying or like judging whether um, a piece of media is worth viewing, you get like you skim an article's headline and you're making a signal detection judgment. You're using the signal from the web page, whether it looks reliable, whether it's an author you've read before and enjoyed, whether the title's any good, etc. That's building up a signal, and you're deciding whether or not to read the article. And if it's an enjoyable article, one that you're glad you read, uh, there and you did read it, then that's a hit. If it's a shitty article and you didn't read it, that's correct rejection. But there are, some amount of good articles that you don't read because the headline was shit or it's a crap website or whatever. That's a miss. And there are some amount of shit articles that it was on the Washington Post and it was someone I normally enjoy, and the headline was really interesting, but it just turned out to be a bit of crap. Um, uh, are there signal detection problems that aren't binomial? So this is kind of only binomial because you're separating out noise from signal plus noise. But I don't know, because no, I think they all they're not necessarily all normal, um, but think I think in at least in theory they're necessarily binomial. I'm not sure in practice if you did like um, plot this out. I think so. Um, Neon Golden, you able to weigh in, because I think you might have a better insight into that. That's a good question. Um, but yeah, so where was I? But yeah, so this applies to like so many areas of life, and you can conceive of. Calm yourself. You've been fed. You can conceive of um, many examples of decisions that that you can view in this lens. Um, so yeah, um, that's kind of just like I figured I'd talk about this because I think it's an um, interesting and very widely applicable. Um, uh, yeah, I think you are necessarily making it binomial, but the question is whether or not, um, because it's the way that you've like organized this. Yeah, um, I'm just not sure whether it's like always a classic, two smooth peak sort of binomial distribution. Um, but you definitely have to to some degree, kind of separated out into two. Um, what's that? My cat's being very insistent today. Um, yeah, but yeah, it's like I said at the start, it's one of those um, relatively straightforward ideas. I'm not an expert in these things, and I've explained it, in general terms in less than an hour. So it's not like it's a massive, super challenging idea, but I think it's one that applies across a wide number of circumstances, whether you're like actually working in, science and technology and thinking about how to detect things, or whether it's just kind of your daily life and you're thinking about how you weigh evidence and how much cost and benefit is in each of these four conditions. I think that's always worth trying to explicitly consider. Uh, if the cost you of a false alarm is very low, but the value of a hit is very high, then you probably want to just be, shifting the criterion over to the left here. Um, and yeah, I would agree that at least the majority of the time it's going to be normally distributed. Like I wouldn't want to say never not going to be, but like um, normal distributions just arise all of the goddamn time. Um, so and in pretty much any like natural setting, you do end up with a normal distribution just because of the kind of well, like central limit theorem. The fact that um, when you're sampling a population that has lots of randomly varying or approximately randomly varying variables, when you sum those all up together, you pretty much always end up with something approximating that at least. Yeah, as you say, neon golden, whenever the sample is large enough, and we're talking about the kind of idealized scenarios here. Yeah, and you can actually that's worth briefly considering. Kind of why do like normal distributions arise? Um, I always find it useful to think about. So let's say again we've got the ethylene sensor we used right at the start as an example. Um, there are many things that could possibly go wrong to in detecting the levels of ethylene. Maybe there's just variations in the thickness of the skin of the apple, so determining how much is released, even if there's some building up inside. There's variations in the electrons that are hitting the sensor and causing false readings. There are all of these kind of many sources of variation that add up so that normally they kind of all cancel each other out and peak around about the top. Sometimes they don't quite cancel each other out in one direction, sometimes they don't cancel each other out in the other direction, and sometimes in very few circumstances they kind of all go in one direction, all go in another. Um, so from just a bunch of different randomly varying uh, variables, when you sum those all up together, you inevitably get not quite inevitably, but almost all the time, get a distribution that looks like that. I probably haven't explained that very well, but actually, at some point, Neon Golden, we should do a stats explainer, or more likely, I should interview you about stats because you're the real expert. I've done like undergrad stats for biomedical scientists, but my lovely fiance is like a tutor in stats and is like legitimately quite an expert. So not to put you on blast or anything, it's no obligation, but I think I'd actually quite like to do a bit more of this sort of like take a concept of science that would be widely applicable. Because we were discussing this bloody thing. I honestly don't know what's up with this. Um, we were discussing this the other day before we did that stream about uh, reading a scientific paper. When we were planning that, we were talking about some of these like ideas that are generally widely applicable, and even if you're not a scientist, it's very um, it's very useful, instructive to kind of understand. Um, yeah, so we'll we'll hold off on the detailed stats explanation for now. But I think things like p-values, they can be a bit frustrating to understand, but once it kind of clicks, it's pretty straightforward. You don't actually need to know any of the maths really like deeply. You just need to know roughly what it's doing. Um, so you don't need to know any of it. It's good to like know a bit, but you don't need to actually be able to like do a t-test yourself on graph paper. Um, you can still get a very good understanding of like I couldn't run through a t-test by hand without a reference. I don't remember the whole formula. It's not even like a particularly long formula, but yeah. So we'll leave that for the moment. But yeah, similarly like probability theory. Um, yeah, nobody remembers the formulas. We all have programs for it. Um, but yeah, probability theory. Again, it's quite a like at its core, it's pretty simple. There's not like a huge complex. Well, obviously there is a huge complex subject you can dive into, but the core idea that you can understand in like sort of a lesson or two is very widely applicable. So if people are interested, I might do a few more of these kind of just like shortish explainer for a like sciencey concept. Um, yeah, that's that's kind of all I had like actually planned. I say actually planned. I didn't really plan anything for this. I just found this picture. Shout out to toponlinegeneral.com. Hmm. Whoever on Google I found this picture from. Thank you. Um, yeah, I'll just have a quick look at the news because the news is ridiculous and weird. Um, but yeah, highly recommended. Raven Rock and The Dead Hand. Politics Dream. Okay, okay. Let's go on then. Let's do a bit of political grumping. Uh, right. Oh yeah, I saw this earlier. I haven't actually delved into it. So, another Supreme Court being surprisingly. Uh, oh, you want crazy transhumanism views? Okay, okay. Um, I can't think of anything at the top of my head. Ask me something. I'll happily respond to questions or whatnot. Um, uh, I mean, one thing I do want to. So Anders Sandberg, wonderful chap, been on the show a few times. Yeah, he is a big supporter of morphological freedom. Um, I was thinking about this the other night when the whole um, thing about like furries and otherkin and whatnot came up. Uh, he has written some interesting stuff on uh, both the kind of ethics and practicalities of engineering ourselves into different forms. And I think next time I have him on, which hopefully should be like next week or the week after, um, I'll ask him a bit about this because he'll be able to give an actual like uh, transhumanist philosopher's take on why uh, well on otherkin and furries. And spoiler alert, he's going to tell you that you need to stop hating on them because they're fine. It's fine. Um, and he is not a furry himself, to the best of my knowledge. But he is a principled ethicist and a defender of morphological individual freedom, and I think he's absolutely right to do so because it's just like they just want to pretend they're animals. Like I say, pretend, if they want to like be animals in a meaningful sense, it's fine by me. But how do you feel about genetic modification of humans that makes them smarter or stronger? Um, or, I guess adding into this, what if you modification of people so that they can, grow wolf ears or something? Um, and I'm so there's modification per se. I'm very very supportive of. I am pretty like extreme into if you want to stick technology in yourself, if you want to change your appearance or your physical capabilities, as long as you're not threatening anyone, um, and I mean like threatening in a meaningful way, not like, oh no, I can't get wolf people in my head. Oh, it scares me to see people walking around with wolf ears. Not that kind of threatening. More of the, if someone wanted to get the old like reductio, I identify as an attack chopper thing. I unironically think people should be able to make themselves into attack choppers if they want. Um, Currently, obviously, there are many technological limitations to that. But the one restriction I would put on there is, yeah, sure, you can make yourself into an Apache. You just, maybe we put fake rocket pods and 20mm cannon on. You don't actually get to, fly around with a big 20mm chain gun for tank hunting purposes. Is it 20mm on the? Um, uh, so this is almost completely irrelevant, but oh no, 30mm chain gun. Okay, M230. Anyway, yeah, you don't get to have a 30mm chain gun that actually functions. Um, like that's about my kind of level of how far you get to modify yourself. Now, genetic modification has a bunch of more complicated implications because if you're undergoing germline modification, at least you are altering not only all of your regular somatic cells, but also your sex cells, which will be passed on to your offspring. In which case, I think it's reasonable to have some limits on germline modification, particularly given that currently the technology we can use to undertake germline modification is, well, you may have seen recently in the news that CRISPR is let's find a note. Why am I? So CRISPR is getting some off target. My crisps off target CRISPR. Um, there's been, okay. Here's the thing I'm thinking of recently. Um, it Yeah. So CRISPR-Cas9 is this wonderful system for using like palindromic repeats in DNA to edit with remarkable impact. Like it does the edits very well, except it also sometimes puts in chunks of DNA where it shouldn't be, which may well be a problem. We're not really sure yet, like quite how much of a problem it is. And so doing this in humans, which it has been. There's a Chinese scientist who got into a lot of trouble for um, using CRISPR on two babies, well, two embryos that were brought to term. Um, that will necessarily have impacts on any offspring you want. So currently, um, I would very much want to. I think the current restrictions on germline modification are probably appropriate. Um, at least, I don't think they're very ideally implemented, but they're probably, reasonable to have some form of restriction there. Just scroll up as I've kind of waffled on a bit past where the discussion has gone to. So yeah, in terms of design of babies, um, it gets dicier. Currently, we don't have the tech to do it reliably, but I'm very positive about developing that tech because longer term, I think that some form of genetic engineering is going to be pretty necessary in order to deal with the fact that um, we do have a. Okay, I don't want to sound like eugenicist here at all, um, because a lot of these kind of points get made very badly and very irresponsibly. Um, there are there are currently selection pressures that we would be facing in nature that we're not in our like constructed environment. So, for example, uh, type 1 diabetes is partly heritable. If I had developed type 1 diabetes in the Stone Age, I'd be dead. Like, I'd just be dead. Um, but now, thanks to medical technology, I'm able to survive. And I am, at least theoretically, able to procreate. I say that not because I'm like an incel, just because I don't want to have kids. Um, so I am passing on my bad genes into the gene pool if I do procreate. Now, I don't think there's anything morally wrong with that. You might be able to make an argument if you have like very, very severe genetic diseases, but generally speaking, I don't think there's anything morally wrong with that. I certainly don't think that the government should be interfering with that. But over successive generations, if completely left unchecked, there are probably some genetic diseases that are going to proliferate in ways that they wouldn't have without modern medicine. Now, I see the best solution to this being to study these diseases, find out how to combat them, and when we can, safely use targeted genetic engineering to remove them from our germline cells, which I think is highly plausible, indeed likely over the coming decades. But we're definitely not at the stage that we can like reliably do that now. Um, uh, do you think the future would be good if we modified ourselves to the point where we were unrecognizable? Um, yeah, like I'm well in favor of that. Like if I want to be a space marine for Warhammer 40,000, is that cool? Well, as long as you don't spit acid on me with your Betches gland or uh, eat my brains with the omniphagia implant. I think that's what it's called, isn't it? All good by me. Um, well, actually, no. So an actual Space Marine from Warhammer 40,000 would involve setting up a nightmarish, like theocratic feudalist system in order to become a warrior monk. I wouldn't support that. Um, I would, however, support your ability uh, to adapt yourself, including with things like very high degrees of strength, because being very strong isn't that much of a superpower really. Like I can get a bulldozer or something and you know pick up someone with like Space Marine type strength, or drive a bus into them or something. Technology and intelligence are much more powerful and much potentially like much more concerning um, for enhancement. Um, I um, I'm not so sure about that Neon Golden. I think uh, I mean sorry, depends on what you mean, because I think the case for eliminating clear physical disease is easier to to message. I think it's easier to persuade people of. But personally, I think the case, um, the philosophical case for each of eliminating physical diseases and enhancing other forms of our experience is pretty much equally strong. I view aging and basically every limitation that we have is a I'm using this somewhat metaphorically, but is a disease. Um, you know, aging, not being as intelligent as we might want, having emotions at inappropriate moments, inappropriate emotions at inappropriate moments. Um, there are so many functions of our biology that we can describe as deleterious in some way to our quality of life. And I think that it should be within the realm of biomedical science to address that. It shouldn't be exclusively in the realm of biomedical science. Um, but I think there's a comparable case for engineering away, say, lack of intelligence that's causing me a lot of distress, as there is for engineering away pain that causes comparable amount of distress. Um, though, of course, yeah, no, you're certainly right that the consequences are more complex and it is kind of more challenging to. Though I mean, it's you kind of have the same thing in some cases with disease, at least. So with intelligence and learning, I think you're very much right. Mm, I don't know, all of these things have really complex downstream effects, even, just treating fairly basic diseases. But yeah, certainly all of this requires, I think, a lot of ethical thought. And this is one of the reasons why, to bring it back around, I'm excited to have, I've closed the tab, um, Brian David Earp on to chat. Um, on Wednesday at 7 p.m. because his book Love Drugs is exactly dealing with a lot of these kind of issues of modulating very complex traits. Um, Also, Stanley Cake you have not been watching too many Warhammer lore videos because there is no such thing as too many Warhammer lore videos, except for Arch Warhammer. Fuck that guy. He's like legitimate Nazi. Uh, but other than that, go wild. Like Warhammer lore videos are great. Um, Actually, just to show my level of nerdery, here is oh shit, what did we Lure of the Void, um, Allure of the Void. Sorry, the Ambition class starship, old Battlefleet Gothic style model that was our rogue trader ship in a recent 40k RPG game, um, RPG campaign. So yeah, I am very much on board with Warhammer lore, um, and I, part of the reason I enjoy Warhammer is because it's such a mashup of all different genres, and you can have a street cyberpunk story alongside a high fantasy kind of space opera story alongside grimdark war story. um, they've just shoved together all of these different stories. I mean, the whole thing's basically ripped from Dune, and I mean that in the most complimentary way because Dune is fucking amazing. Um, the long thing that he's talked about sounds like something about Warhammer. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It does sound like Slann. period of time, or something that maybe the Eldar would have done. Yeah. And yes, June, love. Even the weird 80s June film with like Sting and oh, what's his fucking name? The detective from Twin Peaks and in Desperate Housewives. Doesn't matter. Um, but yeah, I've been to that. I've been to that, or at least I've been to the Twin Peaks diner in uh, Snohomish County, not Snohomish. Carl McLaughlin. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Um, anyway, right. I'm just kind of rambling a bit now. Where are we? Okay. Right. I think I'm going to leave that there. Um, 'Cause yeah. But like I say, Wednesday. Wednesday's my like big day this week. Uh, been waiting a while for Brian to come on. Not that he's been like putting me off. I asked him on a while back, and he was like, "Yeah, sure." And I was like, "Oh, actually, let's talk about your new book. I just need to read it first." And then it took me a while to read. Um, well, to be more precise, it took me a while to start reading it. Once I started, I got through it very quickly because it's a really excellent book, and you know, go out and buy it. It's very good, and Brian is a lovely chap um, who writes a lot of very interesting things. You might have seen his work on circumcision. He writes very well on circumcision and uh, why it's not good, male or female. So yeah, promises to be a interesting discussion. I'm going to focus mostly on love drugs, both drugs that can stimulate love and bring you out of love, and ones that can be used in like therapy, um, things like that. It's it's particularly good as Brian's background is in cognitive science, and Julian's background is in he trained as a physician and also I think has a degree in neuroscience. Um, Actually, a weirdly large amount of the practical ethics like whole department and Future Humanity Institute have neuroscience backgrounds. Neuroscience and physics seem to be two big ones. Um, um, well, hopefully, you know, our discussion on Wednesday will enlighten you and uh, give a bit more girth to to the discussion. Right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for watching. I hope you have a pleasant evening, and yeah, do let me know if you'd like me to see me do more of these kind of, you know, explainer on that bombshell. Yeah, these sort of explainer videos about like sciencey related things. See if I can rope Amy into doing a more stats focused one because, say, I'm not an expert, whereas she is uh, legitimately an Oxford lecturer in the subject. So, yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much. Have a pleasant Wednesday and Monday. Have a pleasant Monday. I will see you on Wednesday, hopefully. I mean, don't worry if you can't make it, but you know. And yeah, thanks again to J Tibbs who subscribed at the start of the episode. If you too would like to subscribe, you know, the click thing down wherever it is, I don't know. Uh, and if you've got Amazon Prime, you can do it for free, assuming you haven't already given your subscription to someone else. And if you have, well, fair enough. You know, there are lots of good content creators on this site, and I am just grateful for your watching. So yeah, bye, Stanley K. Cly. Thanks very much for being a cool viewer as always. And yeah, I will see you around.